In terms of what I do, I'm in charge of what they call strategic planning of water, wastewater services in the city. I've a capital investment programme of about 300 to 400 million every 2 to 3 years. It's a fairly large capital programme. I coordinate business planning for about 2,500 staff in the City Council. I also coordinate the engineering input into emergency planning. So whenever there's an emergency or a disaster, I'm somewhere there trying to fix it, not cause it. You get interesting jobs when you work in local government. In 2004, when we had the large number of other countries join the European Union, I was presidency coordinator for Dublin City. A number of other things there, but I suppose ultimately the most important one is I'm CPD Director of Engineering within Dublin City Council. And that, I suppose, is a challenge to make sure that learning does not finish when you leave school or when you leave college, that lifelong learning is absolutely essential to make sure that we can manage the challenges facing the city. So, in summary, I just said to you, if you're thinking of career engineering, it's actually a particularly good choice. It opens an awful lot of doors. And the reason I chose to work in the public service really is it gives me a unique opportunity to shape the future of the city. There are a couple of examples I've put on the screen here that I'll just share with you during the course of the presentation. So I suppose I'm going to cover essentially 4 topics: introducing Dublin, a water transitioning framework, the various water topics, and then just touch on challenges and opportunities during the course of my presentation. Dublin City. Okay, you all live and work in and around Dublin City and go to school. It has a population of about 500,000 people. The Greater Dublin area is 1.8 million, but what's probably more important is that about 40% of our national population lives in the Dublin area. We tried to develop what we call a sustainable city, and we're integrating really 6 themes: the economic, social and cultural, with the urban form of the city, movement and the environment. So trying to get all of those 6 themes together is what we're trying to do. Over the last 15 years, I'm afraid our Celtic tiger is gone, God bless him or her, but they've left behind a pretty good legacy. You look at things like Temple Bar, the development, Grand Canal Dock, the Port Tunnel, rejuvenation of O'Connell Street, Fatima Mansion. So the legacy of the Celtic tiger is good, and that's how we hope to now to rebuild our national economy. If you look back on those years, there are now people living in the city. Okay, in the 70s and 80s, there was mass migration out of the city into the suburbs. We're fostering, I suppose, a smart economy, and I'll touch on that later on, and particularly investing in infrastructure for the city. Among other things, we're developing a good cruise tourism business. Last year now, about 97 cruise liners came to Dublin, so that's a growing business. But I suppose most of all, what we like to do is welcome people to Dublin. Okay, as we were welcoming you here to our civic offices. You'll see there the Queen, President Obama, who's got himself a new job for the next 4 years. Who's that chap in Croke Park? Anybody know? Okay, Xi Jinping. We hope he's going to get the top job in China, possibly next week or the week after, and he visited Ireland. So it's good to make sure that we're the centre of the world for a while. Dublin, it's a city, I suppose, with a very strong cultural identity. It's a good brand. It is a world-class location, and I suppose what we're pitching for now is to make sure that the opportunities that we have in Dublin turn themselves into jobs and a sustainable society for all of you to grow up in. The economic action plan for Dublin is very simple. It's built on 3 things: creative people, a vibrant place, and strong leadership, mixing those 3 themes together. The Creative Dublin Alliance is local government, universities, business, the creative industries and state agencies, so pooling all of our resources together. We just look for a moment at technology, how it's actually changed things in Dublin. Here are 4 examples. Now, e-planning, so we have an online planning application system. You can use your mobile phone to pay for parking. The Dublin Bikes is quite a success. Every time I have to put this slide up, the 2.3 million has gone up by another couple of 100,000. So that's, I suppose, a very good example. And the integrated passenger information for Dublin Bus. When you look at that, you think, well, that's something very nice that Dublin Bus have produced, but it was actually largely developed by Dublin City Council, our own internal IT department here. If I talk about water, because that's the central theme, I suppose, of my discussion with you today. If we look at the socio-political drivers, matched against service delivery functions. Now, this isn't getting too technical, but if you go back to the very start, 1860, 1880, all around the world was the development of piped water supplies. Dublin, 1860, 1880, San Francisco, 1870, 1890. So all around the world, all the major capital cities developed their water supply infrastructure around the mid-1800s. And I suppose their drivers there were water supply access and security. We then followed on with public health protection. So although I didn't coordinate my presentation with Darren, you'll see the linkage between his presentation and what we're trying to do in Dublin. So that was public health protection, the sewered city, and what you were trying to do is make sure that the public health of people living in cities was protected. Dublin in the 1900s was one of the very first capital cities in the world to have a wastewater treatment plant. So we were very advanced in terms of our urban planning in Dublin even a century ago. We then moved on to flood protection, the drain city. So now that we've got water coming in and dealing with public health, how to make sure that we're safe living in the urban environment was our next challenge. But moving on from that then, we're looking to the future, a waterway city. And that's when you're trying to integrate social amenity with environmental protection. Then you look at the water cycle city, looking at the fact that there are limits on natural resources. Okay, there are finite limits on the amount of water that we have to work with. So how can we work within a finite capacity? And then looking at, I suppose, the ultimate goal is what I call a water-sensitive city. Now, among other things, you're trying to deal with difficult concepts like intergenerational equity. What that means in simple terms is, I'm not going to do something today that's going to compromise your options and opportunities for the future. So that, I suppose, is the structure. And I'm going to centre my talk on the first three: water supply, the sewered city, and then the drain city. Just start off, we have a series of link strategies linking our drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and probably the most important thing to look at those is that they're projected very far into the future. So we're projecting at least 40 to 50 years into the future with our planning processes. The Dublin water supply area, 7 local authorities working together. We output every day 546 million litres of drinking water. We've about 9,000 kilometres of water main throughout the Dublin region. So it's a pretty large network that we have to manage on a daily basis. If I look at the water cycle for a moment, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but it starts with rain. Contrary to what everybody thinks, it doesn't rain every day in Ireland, but we need to store that rainwater in reservoirs for days that it doesn't actually rain. We then need to clean it in water treatment plants. Our largest water treatment plant is down in Blessington. That produces over half of the drinking water for the Dublin region. We then have to store it, intermediate storage reservoirs, the like of water towers. That's one up on the M50 if you ever drive around the Ballymun area. We distribute it through a network of 9,000 kilometres until we deliver it to the customer. That's all of you. You, I'm afraid, return it to us in a most disgusting condition. That goes down the plug hole in the toilets. We then have to clean it up again before we return it into the sea. So that is the rain cycle all over. And I suppose if you look at what are we trying to do then to develop that, well, we're working on 5 parallel action lines: demand management, developing new sources, new infrastructure, rehabilitating our old assets, and then focusing on leakage control, so dealing with leaks within the network. In terms of the future, we know that within the next 8 years we need a new water supply for Dublin. Okay, the existing ones will still be with us, but we need to top it up. We looked in the recent past at 10 water supply options, everything from desalination, in other words piped seawater, to groundwater, to options involving the River Shannon. And when we looked at that, the benefiting local authorities is not just the greater Dublin region, but it's about 14 counties in Ireland, so it's a national project. The recommended option after all of those studies was centred first of all on developing a Midlands storage facility and water-based eco-park. The intention behind this is to have a storage reservoir in the middle, and the outer ones are environmental cells, and that down there would be the water treatment plant. It's a 1,400-acre site. It's a cutaway bog. If you've never heard that term, the bog is gone. You're down to bedrock, so that area has to be rehabilitated. On the day that it opens, that will hold 4 months' drinking water supply for the Dublin region. When it is fully developed, it will be down to 2 months. And if we find that we need to further develop that, because with climate change we may not, I suppose, know everything that's going to happen in the future, by 2040 there's another cutaway bog there that will hold another 4 months storage should we need it. So we've climate change proofed this as far as we possibly can into the future. I suppose the model is based, there are many models that you could build it on, but the model we chose is the Rutland water model. It's Rutland water over in the UK. I suppose, best way of describing it is it's in the middle of nowhere, a most picturesque area, but it attracts 1 million visitors a year. So not only developing a water opportunity, but also a sustainable tourism opportunity as well. The intention is that that storage facility will be filled from Lough Derg when we have high and flood flows in the River Shannon, and then at any time when the flows in the Shannon are that little bit lower, we'll then use the storage facility. The quantity of water that we're going to take is about 2% of the average flow. So the Shannon will be absolutely unchanged by this water abstraction, and then deliver it to the Dublin region. Why are we doing this? Well, I suppose population growth is one thing, but if we look at the moment in Ireland, just in 3 sectors at the moment, agri-food, pharmaceuticals and ICT, we have about 273,000 people working in high-quality, good-paying jobs. Within 10 years, that can grow to 457,000. So the possibility is that 150,000 high-quality jobs can be generated in the Dublin and East region and the Shannon region as a direct result of this investment. So this, I suppose, as much as anything else, is your futures that we are trying to prepare for. Conservation, absolutely essential. And this is an extract from our Tap Tips website, which, if you've ever looked on it, and I would recommend you might have a look at it, it gives simple, practical suggestions as to how you can save water if you're an individual, householder, or if you're a business. Okay, we take good examples from wherever we can find them anywhere in the world. Okay, trying to, I suppose, conserve water and use as little as absolutely possible. Leakage control, very complicated. I could spend hours talking about this. But when I talk about managing leaks, there are really 3 types of leaks. There's big leaks. Okay, the good news about big leaks is they find you, and you're able to repair them quite quickly. There are smaller leaks. Okay, some of them are quite tiny, and we find them using people and technology. So we've invested very heavily in our people. But last of all, then, there are absolutely tiny leaks. This is a good example of a pipe that's 100 years old. We cleaned that one. That particular one stayed together. The first time I asked one of my crews to clean an old pipe for me, he came back with a plastic bucket with bits of metal in it. And he says, I'm afraid there was no metal left to actually clean it properly. So that's an old water main, and really that's our challenge, to replace a lot of those, and we're already doing that. We started our water conservation project back in 1996. At that stage, the leakage level in the Dublin region was 42.5%. The reason why it was 42.5% is there was no money to replace our water network. So water mains that were put down in the 1890s and 1900s, before the motor car was even developed, were still providing daily service, but were gone beyond their useful life. We're now down at 28%, and by the year 2020, we will be best compared to any water utility anywhere in the world. Just an example, because at the moment in Ireland people don't pay directly for water, we've very little data on how people use water. And when we were replacing a lot of the network, we'd start by replacing in a small area maybe half, and we found that the unaccounted for water, which is usually leakage, was 19%. We replaced about 70% in another area, and unaccounted was 19%. And eventually we replaced 90%, and you've guessed it, unaccounted for water was 19%. So we couldn't square that. Either my people were doing a terribly poor job in replacing the water mains, or there was something that we hadn't figured out. So what we did is we carried out a pilot metering project near the Merrion Gates, where we replaced 100% of the old mains. And we found there was no leakage at all, but unaccounted for water was still 19%. So we put a meter on every house there, a smart meter. And what we found was truly shocking. One house, instead of using 500 litres a day, was using 35,000 litres, the same amount of water as 80 houses. The second one, same amount of water as 50 houses. So 3 houses we're using the same amount of water as all the other houses combined in that area. There were leaks, inevitably under the front garden or driveway, never in the house, always on private property, but by finding those leaks, we're able actually to save quite an amount of water. So if you look at universal metering that's coming down the road, this is the reason why it's coming in order to try to conserve water. This is an interesting example of a data visualization of that same area, looking at who are the high water users and presenting that data in a way which actually makes it easy for myself as a manager of the network to manage water. And that's working with IBM, who've opened one of 14 smart technology centres out in Damastown, and water is one of the key themes that we're working with them on. If I look at drainage for a moment, our Greater Dublin Strategic Drainage Study was delivered in 2005, and it covers up to 2031 with a whole raft of policies. But in summary, what we're trying to do in drainage is expand our Ringsend wastewater treatment plant, which is underway at the moment, build new city centre sewers, because remember some of these are 200 years old as well, connect new trunk sewers, build a new North County wastewater treatment plant. The site for that is under active consideration at the moment. Build a new orbital sewer, and then trunk sewers to connect into that. So that is the blueprint for the next 30 years for the development of Dublin. Central to that is the use of what I call sustainable urban drainage systems. And the intention of a sustainable system is to replicate what nature does. So rain falls and it goes into the ground, it's absorbed by the earth. So you don't pipe it somewhere else and hope that it vanishes without any environmental consequences. At the moment now, one of the big challenges we face on flooding that I'll touch on in a moment is driveways are being paved over. So that produces more water thrown out onto the road into drains that are over 100 years old that were never built to accommodate that type of runoff. Here are just some of the old drains under the city and what they look like. Okay, these are just snapshots. Many of them are very good, very well constructed, but really not fit for purpose in terms of modern drainage systems. An example in Philadelphia, just to go outside Ireland for a moment, of what is, I suppose, sustainable urban drainage systems. What do they look like? I suppose what they do is they integrate things like stormwater tree trenches, green roofs, rain barrels. Yep, we have some of those here. Pervious paving. Okay, that's paving that absorbs water. When it falls on it, it goes straight down into the ground. Looks the same as normal paving, but what it means is it doesn't throw extra surface water out into an overloaded drainage system. Bump outs, flow-through planters, stormwater planters, rain gardens, and then stormwater wetlands. So these are, I suppose, part of the modern green technology that we now need to integrate into our drainage system. So that's what Philadelphia aims to look like in the future. Legislation. Legislation drives an enormous amount of what we do in water resource planning and management. And the EU produce what they call directives that are binding on all member states. The good news, however, is that while the outcomes are binding, how you get to those is left open. And a lot of EU research programs then give us an idea of how we might get to where we want to be in an innovative way. This is an example under the Water Framework Directive. What we're trying to do is move from wherever we are on this graph up to either high or good ecological status. As I say, the targets are binding on all member states, but how you get to them is quite flexible. And Dublin is coordinating at the moment what's called the Eastern River Basin District Project. That's 12 local authorities and 33 public bodies working together. I'll tell you, keeping all those parties pointed even roughly in the same direction is quite a challenge. Flooding, the last theme. Okay, that was not Venice yesterday, although it could have been because they're flooded once again. And really, in terms of recent major European flooding, Dublin made it in October 2011 when we were hit by a pluvial floodstorm. If you've never heard the term pluvial flooding, I call it monster rain, which is exactly what it is. Intense rain, monsoon-like intensity, overwhelms the drainage system. It can never fit in it. So trying to develop a strategy to deal with that is quite challenging. While we were hit in October 2011, Copenhagen was also flooded in July 2011. And their flooding was so intense that steel manhole covers were blown 12 foot up into the air by the pressure of water.